Evenings together, we'll try to talk a little bit about the healing of the dilemmas that we have outlined the development of. It's an obvious thing to say, but important to say it, that there will be no help in love or psychotherapy for the person trapped in the dilemma of casting pearls unless they really intend to change it. Because we now have a person who believes that non-expression is right. May not be the total feeling, but there is now a value structure that holds energy, that can resist dynamic, that stands against the creative spirit. And while the person may feel other things, the value stands in part against expression, resolution. So one will get nowhere unless, in addition to that value, there is a discontentment with the value, with the place that it's taken the person to, unless there is still a remnant of the old flame that was a part of that person's character and creative spirit still alive and struggling. The reason that's a crucial thing to say is that there are persons who present themselves for psychotherapy and bring themselves to love, who bring their discontentment, their misery, their suffering is evident, but they bring it as a problem to you to do something about, with no intent on their part to change the way they see the world, to bring that change about. For those of you who are either in training to do psychotherapy or do it, that's a very important thing to understand. We often think that everyone who comes wants help, when in actuality the minority of people who come for psychotherapy really want help and intend to change their lives, whether you help them or not. Most of them want to feel better or not be in the misery that they're in, but they don't want to do anything about it themselves, and they don't intend to change their ideas or to challenge them. So they look to you to do something for them. And if the kind of person that we're talking about in this course comes to relationship or therapy with no intent to challenge the philosophy that they've now come to value, you'll get nowhere with them. The therapy may have a honeymoon of interest on their part, some brief hope that things can be better, may have some experiences, if you are a powerful person, of their being touched or aroused, but nothing will come of it. No momentum will come from it. And in time the person will be disenchanted with you, as with every person and experience that they've looked to change the blocking of the creativity when they really don't want it. So the first very important thing is that for some reason the person must really want to change it. And obviously that can't be a fleeting demand or desire, because the work at changing the kind of dilemma that we've sketched in this course takes years. It is very hard work and very slow work to change values. And it's not saying that the person won't have progress if they really work at it within those years, but it's going to take years to change those values. And a modest intent will not budge the kind of problem that we're talking about here. Now, essentially the dynamic, which we've hinted at before, is an alchemical one. The person comes, as alchemy would describe, leaden, stopped, blocked. All the elements of their character and personality creatively totally in check, in ambivalence. Values lined up against expression, things turned into frustration, everything against everything else, leaving the person totally non-dynamic, with nothing to say, no spirit, depressed, slowed down, numbed, as we talked about last week, unfeeling, the product of the checking of all of these forces. Now, if you come to a person in love or therapy that is not an open person in his or her life away from you, then all you do is all that you do is continue to experience your blocking. It is a known thing that dead therapists can help many people. Therapists who are themselves blocked, have given up on life, cynical in their personal lives, laid back, cautious, can help certain kinds of persons who are themselves still relatively open, but are blocked by ignorance in unraveling the problems that would open their lives up again. In other words, they are not in need of dynamic, caring, faith, a change in value. All that they're in need of is knowledge. And if they come across a person with knowledge, even if that person is dying, their dying is not a total inhibition to their being helped. And the same thing is true in love and friendships. If we come across a person that is wise or knowledgeable about life and ourselves, if we are open and growing and in the process of that, people who are dead can give something to us by reacting to us. A relationship may not work out over the long run, but they may say things to us or treat us in certain ways that really help us in our lives if we have the movement already. However, if you're talking about the kind of person we're dealing with in this course that's gone through the convolutions of closing up and is now finally lined up in value against himself or herself, if you are yourself a blocked person and have retreated from life, there is no way that you can help them, because knowledge isn't enough. The value stands against the knowledge. The value, again, being an adynamic, non-historical storehouse of energy, is unresponsive to knowledge and by and large unresponsive to experience. So that if you simply bring knowledge to it, knowledge breaks against it. Knowledge without energy, knowledge without passion, knowledge without assault is impotent against value. So that a dead therapist or a dead lover joins the leaden, ambivalent, stopped person, and all that happens is that in their reaction to you or feeling about you, they stir you up a bit, perhaps make your frustration with yourself a little bit greater, cause you to think a bit, but nothing comes of it. However, if they are in truth, not by sham or profession, but in truth, open persons who are whose energies come into play expressively, openly, vulnerably, in some real way, then they form around the blocked person, the leaden person, an unsupportive cauldron, if you want to speak alchemically, of moving energy which serves to undermine the ambivalence. So that what winds up happening, again following Jung's metaphor, is that the ambivalences start to fall apart. Not because, and this is very important, the person is changing from within yet, but because the person is in an atmosphere that is unsupportive of their resolution of the problem of casting pearls, namely non-expression. They're around someone that expresses, that feels, that doesn't believe what they believe, that is, in that sense, if invited to be, at war with them. So the value is unsupported and opposed not by frustration, which is all that a blocked person could mount against their values, or opposed by ideas or gimmicks, but is in truth opposed by energies that are vital, sharp-edged, clear, discriminating, and that have the power to injure value because of the energic, directive component of passion when it's open. It's a very powerful force. And it may not slay value, but it can injure it, dent it, make it self-conscious. And in that, threaten to unglue some of the energy that is imprisoned in the structure of a non-expressive value, which then threatens to alter the power balances of the ambivalences of that person's character. So that the once stable checkmate in the person who is blocked around a person that is passionately open, who cares about them, and that they want to be influenced by, serves to immediately and in an unstable way begin to upset the person that is blocked. That can happen in the first meeting, which may be described in relationship as falling in love with someone that feels you in your deadness and cynicism, and you may have an amazing first meeting with a person who is drawn to you and cares about you, that is open, and say things that you haven't said in a long time, let go sexually, feel things, cry, feel anger, feel disturbed. The same thing in a therapy. When a dead person that is walking around professionally, doing their life, runs across a live wire, if you want to think in terms of the movie with I think it's I can't bring up the name of the film though, but there was a character in it called the High Voltage Christ with Peter O'Toole. If you run across a person like that, you in therapy, that puts fingers in light sockets, as that character did, is getting transfusions of spiritual, aesthetic, healing energies, and meets you strongly in the first meetings with a person like that, you may be thrown. And where you have not felt things in months and sometimes years, you may feel again at all the levels that one feels when one meets a lover like that. The experience is unstable because the feeling is not coming from you in a step-by-step way, working out your problems from within yourself, which is the way that people who are relatively open when they fall in love grow or change through the relationship. Namely, if two relatively open people come to each other, they trust no more than they feel trust. But as they trust more, they open a door, they integrate that knowledge, they learn something, they see something, they make a step, they feel a little fear, they take a half step backward, they trust a little more, they step, and there is a gradual growth, a gradual openness that follows not a predictable pattern, but if one looks at relationships over time, they follow a kind of sense like that that comes from an unfolding from within. And the same thing in psychotherapy. A relatively open person who comes for change, as they peel the layers of their conflict, gradually comes out of withdrawal or denial or defensiveness and is more real, more truthful, whatever, from within. Not so with people who are characterologically blocked. The process is not stable like that and organic like that. It is by definition an explosive, unstable chemistry happening between a person that is totally pent up and an open situation or an open person. And the growth takes place between those persons, not within the blocked person. The change within the blocked person is an echo of the change between them. It is the integration of the unstable experiences that happen between the blocked person and the lover or the doctor. So that what happens in the course of this, although it's not predictable at all, is often something like an initial opening out of my feeling, which is way ahead of what I'm ready for or ready to claim. Then I'm thrown, I back off, way off, maybe quit the therapy, not see the woman or the man, feel scared to death, full of paranoia, wanting to forget them, perhaps a tremendous fit of doubting of that person because I've had an experience that I don't really believe in and I don't really want. So what are you doing to me? What's your trip? What kind of fucked up magic are you bringing to me to make me do something that I can't claim? I may want to change, but not that much. Because if I change that much, my tears, my beauty, my music, my feeling will be seen again, and I don't want it to be seen. So what are you doing to me? Incidentally, the nature of the values of non-expression can often become so powerful that they are in truth demonic. They are not just bitter, philosophical lack of faith in people or life, but often in the course of our coming to our non-expression, we run across people and philosophies that have ingredients of evil in them. And because the nature of a value is that it is an inert, non-dynamic thing, we often add to that the quality of, if you mix that with the voice of evil and evil persons who do not believe in love or truth or beauty, if you add that in, the separateness of value as a structure weds to evil to form the kind of independent, dissociated voice that is really what a demon is. No matter what your personality is, or in other respects, or what your feelings are, there is someone that sits on your shoulder or behind your left ear or in your hip pocket who is whispering malignant things to you about life and people, and doesn't listen to you when you talk back to it, and is a poisoner, more than a criticizer, a poisoner, more than sadistic, demonic, an independent, autonomous voice and force in your personality that destroys anything that is beautiful or loving that approaches you. The sort of personification of the evil eye that we talked about. And often, after a person who is blocked in the experience of being around somebody that isn't, and having the truth crack their armor and break out some of their love and feeling out of their body and whatnot, there is a tremendous aftershock of questioning that comes from the value. And if the value is demonic, has demonic proportions, there is a tremendous intensity of turning against the person or the situation that opened you up. And it can come out in therapy as a really violent attack of negative transference, a very incisive criticism of the doctor for this experience. And when people are detached, and not only that, wise persons emotionally, if you wed that to the fear that is behind transference and self-protection, these people can be amazingly incisive about people that they know relatively little, if anything, about personally, which is why people in psychotherapy have a knack for putting their fingers in the wounds of the therapist. And it is just almost a totally predictable thing that as fast as you go through conflicts in your personal life, and sometimes there's sort of a feeling like, God, I hope they'll give me at least a week before they start talking about this with me, you can bet that the next day, after you've run across something that's kept you up until 3 in the morning working out, and your Band-Aids aren't holding very well when you go in there, you can bet that one of the first 2 or 3 persons is going to stick their thumb right in that place. They've never talked about it before. They've never had that whim about you, and they'll be right onto it. So that's part of what transference is about. Transference is difficult enough for a doctor or a lover to live with when it has the normal proportions that go with people's fear that are relatively intact again. But an assault of transference from a person that has been broken open by you or a situation has a violence to it and incisiveness to it that can really be murderous, not only in terms of its intensity and its clarity of insight into you, but perhaps much more importantly, in defense of the negative value. The attack is often potent philosophically. What are you doing to me? How do you know what my life is going to be if I open up? You can't know that. People still kill themselves after therapy. What if after I open myself up, I find, and I feel that I've had to close up to this degree because I can't, I couldn't take one more blow or I would have taken my life. Are you telling me that I should open up again? And if I'm hurt again and I die, how can you be right? I've known patients of yours that didn't get well. I've heard things about you. You were divorced, weren't you? Your children are this or that. Do you really know that I should feel again at all levels of where that comes? Can you really say that I will be happy? Can you really say that it will be worth it? And if you are not convinced philosophically, not of obviously whether whether people are going to be happy if they're open, which is not really your responsibility to know the answer to, and if you get sucked into that one, you really get led down the garden path. And you're really a fool for casting yourself in the role of crystal balling what's going to happen to another person or guaranteeing their fate to them. Because we are not our brother or sister's keepers, let alone prognosticators of what's going to happen to them. But if you yourself are not an open person by philosophical belief, when that attack comes on you, if your philosophy can't hold in relationship to it, the power of the demonic assault will slay you, and your new relation with this person, and that's when the new lover, after an exciting beginning with a person that's been closed, withdraws and the relationship goes to hell. Or the therapist withdraws in fear from the patient, and the therapy is either over at that moment if the therapist is honest about it, namely, I can't handle you, you make me afraid, you're going to have to go to somebody else, I can't talk to you, I'm personally involved. And it is the unusual therapist that has enough of a handle on his pride to be able to say that to a person. Most therapists would go on, but from that point on, would be uninvolved and would do a good professional job of therapy with a person that they are essentially afraid to be involved with, and as a consequence will not help. And the blocked person will somehow know that, take care of the therapist, never bring out the demon again, because it's really not needed. The demon has done the work. The therapy is a charade that lives out until both persons can graciously finish it without either one of them being too obviously hurt. The blocked person is ambivalent about the therapist's death or the lover's death, because if the value wins, then it is supported. I feel sad because I wish you could have held against me, which might have given me hope. But if you die, then maybe my negativity is right and my cynicism is right. And all of those Don Quixotes that speak for expression and beauty are really liars that feel exactly like I do. It's all jive, the talk of changing what I feel. So I can go on with the ambivalence again because it's been strengthened. I can kill off my spirit for a while again because my negativity won. Again, a comment about psychotherapy as a profession. In the days of my training, in the 50s and early 60s, it was already starting to die in the early 60s, there was a part of liberal arts education and psychological education. It was a part of that related to a general philosophical education. And I don't mean in the philosophy of science. I mean a general philosophical education of philosophies of living, cosmology, epistemology, theories of knowledge. In other words, you thought through what your feelings about life were and the relation of persons to that philosophy, your concept of history. And you placed your psychology in the context of what could be called a philosophical anthropology, a doctrine of persons that related to how you saw life. And you placed your therapy in that context so that you had a basis for it, a foundation for it. We live in an aphilosophical or anti-philosophical era where people are trained as experts and are philosophically ignorant. The philosophy is not articulated and sorted out. It is a simple behaviorist, expedient, model-based concept that is really nothing but the echo of the techniques of the therapy. It is not an independent philosophy of its own. It's simply putting the psychology in other terms so that if this kind of a therapist or lover even approaches a hardcore, blocked off creative person, there is no way that they can affect that person, because when the philosophical assault comes, they have nothing to say. They are left speechless, and even if they don't agree with the sophisticated negativity that comes at them, they can't answer it. They have no argument against it. And to not be able to be at war philosophically with this kind of patient or lover is to get nowhere. So you have to have a philosophical lover or doctor. And it doesn't mean that you got to talk philosophy explicitly. If you get into that kind of a rap, that's pointless. But the philosophy better be there for when the assault comes, so that the dust is still standing after the axe has been swung against him or her, and the other person knows it. And a very helpful way of making interpretations or teaching your lover what their negativity and their negative values are doing to them is to be able to relate them to their philosophy of life, and to also be able to contrast what that dilemma, how that dilemma affects the person if their values were different. And you can only do that if you are philosophically savvy and conscious to be able to see how a person's values are influencing what they do. And if you haven't thought about that, and you give strictly psychological interpretations, you will get nowhere. It doesn't help a blocked creative person to say to them, you don't let yourself be open because you've been hurt by X, Y, Z. That's not helpful. They'll just say, yeah, I know that, yeah, so, and that's true. So, now if you said to a person who had repressed their hurts, who was relatively open, the hurts by X, Y, Z, and they don't know why they're not open, you know you're closed because your mother ignored you when your feelings, or even though you think your wife loves you, there isn't a feeling bone in her body for you, and every time you've ever shown yourself, she's not felt it or hurt you. If the person doesn't know that, it's like, ding, the bells ring, yes, and the feeling comes forward and the insight helps, if there isn't a philosophical confusion. But if there's a philosophical part of it, if you give a strictly psychological comment to a person who's blocked, it doesn't help. Because philosophically, they know why they turned off on it often, but they have no intent to turn on again because of it. Because they now don't believe in being open. So the nature of the interpretations more helpfully follow along the lines of you believe in being a mensch, a brave person, a person who keeps feeling from being seen and yet goes on with it and whatnot. And yet when you do that, other people can't feel you because you don't allow them to, and hence you don't see anyone who presents to you a reason to feel any more open than you already do, which is not open at all. Everybody looks like an asshole to you because you don't turn anybody on, so nobody touches you. If you were an open person, experiences might happen to you which would make you feel very differently. But there's no way that an experience can happen to you believing the way that you do and how it winds up affecting you. And something like that can make a person who's blocked think. You want, or interpretations that follow along that same line creatively. So that one has to be philosophically aware and knowledgeable and on. The same thing is also true in relation to, and it's a comment that I made early in this course, that if you have a doctor that is in too much personal conflict, too bruised at a given time in his or her life, or a lover that's tired, you get the same problem in the therapy, namely that, or the relationship, that while they may be together philosophically and believe in openness, when the counterattack comes, they simply don't have the energy to absorb the hurt of it. And they fold in self-doubt and in hurt to you. The doctor whose feelings get too hurt to be able to continue responding to this kind of person and back off. And the lover that does the same. I'm just not together enough to be able to take you on. You hurt me too much, and I don't have the resources to bounce back right now. So I'm just going to space out and deal with you from a distance. Which is what argues, particularly in psychotherapy, for taking care of yourself and not running yourself to the ragged edge, or you can never help people like this. Now, another thing about the instability of these relationships and therapies. Because they don't have in them the humanity and the natural taking care of that goes with change processes that are more natural and organic, where the person is unfolding within. Because when that kind of process takes place, people don't let themselves feel any more than they can handle. In this kind of therapy, by definition, where a powerful blocked force is up against a powerful external force, by definition, in the instability of this chemistry, things happen that are way out ahead of the person's ability to handle them. And if they are not successful in stopping them by an aftershock of negativity, which stops the influence of the therapy and restores the ambivalence, if that doesn't work, if the doctor or the lover hold in the counterattack, it is often a part of loves and therapy relationships like this that the energy not able to integrate itself easily and naturally into the unfolding personality of the person, because the person is still blocked, still believes the same things, is still just as hurt, and will only catch up to this knowing in time. There is no place to put all of this openness that I don't accept, so I turn it into incredible attacks of terror, anxiety, depression, and fits of self-directed negativity. You can watch persons in the best and wisest of loves and therapies go into amazing self-destructive funks, where this, at extremes, demonic energy imprisoned in the value, now threatened, turn against the person. And they're in bad shape to start with. They feel shitty about themselves to start with, because they haven't really changed their self-concept yet. They were self-hating persons when they presented themselves for therapy, and now suddenly all of this life that you've stirred up against them, that they can't, in them, that they can't handle, is turned into its opposite very capriciously, and they have terrible attacks of self-hatred, often of suicidal proportions. And these kinds of people are often suicidal in their therapies and in the love relationships that change them. And if you don't understand that, and if you're afraid of that, and if you don't understand that that fit or mood of self-hatred is life turned into its opposite, and it's not legitimate self-hatred, what you will do in the face of that is panic, back off, and put the lid on that person again. Namely, there's a blush of, I can help, then I see a terrible aftershock to it, and I get scared, and I say, I better leave that person alone and not rock their boat of their values, of their life, of who they are. Leave them alone. If it's going to stir up that kind of thing in them, it's not right. If you're a therapist, you lose faith in helping. If you're a lover, you space out about it. But if you understand that that bout is really a life thing that they have no place for, and you can articulate that to the person and help them understand that the power of their negativity isn't negativity, it is a life thing that is behind where they're at the moment. That helps them to live with that without suiciding, with your understanding. And obviously you can't be jiving them. If you jive them, they know it. But if it's true that that's a life thing, it is reassuring enough that they may be able to live through the violence of these attacks and continue on with the therapy or the relationship and with the upsetting of the ambivalence that will eventually lead to the cure or the helping or the healing. It can lead to incredible, totally immobilizing depressions, where a person came to you feeling bad, briefly feels better, and then feels worse than they've ever felt, can hardly talk, can hardly move. Again, if it psychs you out, you'll back off. If you understand, you can help them understand that that depression, again, is an unexpressed life, and that when they are down the road, have a place for the expression of that life, the energy won't go to depression, it will go to something else. And the same thing with terror. Terror can be a life energy that has no place, converted into something else. You can have near psychotic terrors in blocked people made unstable by being around love, passion, and openness. They are just terrified, symptomatic, hypochondriacal, nuts, terrors when they drive, terrors in the night, afraid to sleep. And if you are frightened by these manifestations of strong feeling, you will back off of what you're doing, and if you're not, you'll go ahead. If you go ahead, it is by definition dangerous. People do lose their minds in this kind of process. People do have destructive experiences where their feelings are hurt, sometimes hurt other people, emotionally and otherwise. Often feel when they, if that energy turns into a rage, all of that previously stably blocked anger worked out against myself, suddenly blown open, may take the form of, I'm going to buy a fucking gun and climb to the top of the tower. I hate everybody. I hate everybody that's hurt me. And I'm not going to anymore hurt myself by keeping myself from expressing my beauty. I'm just hurting myself with how I've been dealing with this. I'm not going to give them my beauty anymore. I'm going to give them my fucking rage. I'll murder the bastards. That's what they deserve for it. And all of that resentment that is tied up in the ambivalence suddenly shoots out like an arrow of fantasy towards other people. And it can be scary. People become potentially dangerous. And again, if you don't understand it or you're psyched out by it, you'll make them feel guilty. You'll give them a little lecture on acting out, on rage, on if you feel like you're going to hurt somebody, why don't you call me? And you'll get the family lined up, ready, the straitjackets and the lawsuits and the county hospital and the Thorazine and God knows what else, ready to line up to take care of this rage. And in the very doing of that, the fear will convey that you can't handle it, and the lid will go on the whole thing again. If you're not afraid of it, you have to live with that kind of dangerous rage. And it isn't all neat like this. It's openness that overnight can turn into a depression, that overnight turns into a panic, and people are very unstable. And keep in mind that while they're going through this, they don't feel good about themselves. They don't have any pride. It's been in a positive sense. It may have been months or years since they've done something that they respect. And now they are on a tremendous roller coaster of feeling that is largely negative. But it is open. It is an open energy. And at times in it, in that instability, they get flashes of the old self. Namely, I'm terrified, and something happens or a person calls, and even though I was in this blocked state, because I've been blown open by being around you, I did something creative. I heard a song again. I was loving again. I actually was open again. I got some thoughts. I felt good for a few hours or 30 seconds or whatever it was. But it's enough so that I remember the life before the convolutions. And if I can remember that, and I have a friend to remind me of that is there, that the potentiality for that experience is there, and that the other emotions are that turning into other things because you simply can't handle it yet and don't believe it yet. And those glimpses of realness and openness break past, historically, the months and years that you've blocked yourself to give you faith that you can be open again and feel again, to remind you of your value in that way that is different from the value of being blocked, which begins to raise hell, because that kind of energy, being open and powerful, raises hell with value as structure, with your value of non-expression. And you find yourself then in this very unstable chaos of bad feeling, glimpses of the once you at your best, and perhaps better than you've ever been, because when creativity breaks through in these kinds of incredibly powerful block situations, the creativity is often incredible in its dimension, in its depth, in its wisdom, in its color, in its texture. It's amazing. So that you are stunned by your beauty. You stun the person who shares this with you, and yet you still don't believe in doing it and don't believe that you can, and yet you have and do, and are somehow nervous that you will again if you don't watch it, if you stay around these people that are shaking you up. so that you are philosophically tumbling around, sometimes violently believing in what you've made yourself believe, sometimes doubting it, sometimes feeling very different, but it is all in chaos. And in my experience of this goes on for months and sometimes years. It isn't always as open as I'm describing, because people can't live with this kind of open turmoil consistently and stay alive. I mean, without getting mononucleosis or getting worn out or thyroid problems or whatever it is, because it's a wild life. And in it, incidentally, it calls for a therapist or a lover that when people get worn out in this, counsel and support, taking care of yourself, backing off from it for a while if you have to. I'm a person, for example, that believes in the value of interrupting therapy. I don't believe in keeping people's nose to the grindstone till they finish. There are times when they need to rest. And if you are an open, energetic person, there's no way they can rest around you without you being unnatural. So the only way to rest is to stay away from you for a while. And those are the times when they can gather the energy to make another run at it. So there is a certain wisdom involved in that too, that you can't get involved in one of these overly simplified breakthrough mentalities in therapy or love, where you think what you're going to do with a person that's been blocked for years is make some kind of a few-month run at them, and because you're able to bust them open, they're suddenly going to see the light, change everything that they believed overnight, and be an open person again. That's bullshit. They're going to do that. They're going to reconstitute their belief. They're going to alter their philosophy of casting pearls a little bit to allow a little bit of openness. I can well up, but I can't cry. I can do this, but not that. Philosophies change gradually. Values change gradually. And if you try to just bust it open, you may hurt the person if they don't get a rest in this, and may falsely get discouraged in what you're trying to do yourself. As I said to start this all, it often takes years, not because it takes years to get to feeling. You often get to the feeling of openness right off. But it takes years because the values often have to undo themselves through all the same steps they went through to get to the block state. Person can't throw out the value overnight. It's resistive to experience and understanding, and also we tend to change values by restating them a little bit, so that what you see happening in a person like this is a gradual building of a confidence through the integration of this alternately negative, positive chaos. In other words, a self starts to grow again, a positive self, independently of this madness that is very painful. And the philosophy changes to allow more expression, which allows the possibility of experiences which don't support the old values and lead to a further undermining. Now, I want to say one thing in closing about this particular kind of healing in love or therapy, and that is that almost always, even if the person is willing to change and is around a person who has the kind of energy, patience, and love that can effect this kind of alchemical chaos, massa confusa, as the alchemical literature would call it, confused mass, even if they're around that, if external experiences don't happen outside the therapy and the relationship to support the challenge of casting pearls, it is very difficult, though not impossible, for the person to change. There are rare persons that can change a value without experience contradicting it. But much more, the rule of thumb is that experiences need to happen outside the change thing that undermine the value. And interestingly, though not as a sure thing, they often do simply because the person is more open again, following the logic of life gives to you what you give to it. If you're blocked off, nobody wants anything to do with you, with a rare exception. And if you're open, there is often, though not always, a response. Because that is not a sure thing, in my opinion, no one has a right to say to a blocked person, unblock yourself, because it's worth it. And as a therapist, and as a friend to people, I would never get cornered about that. I would never say to my students here, be open. I would never say that. Because one doesn't know if that's worth it. You only know that in your experience. One can speak to the values of that way of life and to what blocking does to you. But to say, be open, one doesn't know what comes. And what may come to you is more brutality and non-response to your beauty, namely the things that caused you to retreat in the first place. And if that happens with most people who are trying to change this in love and therapy, they don't change. The experience aspect is really important. And if the experiences support the change, then the change takes place. And you can watch this very sensitively happen to creative block people in their therapies, where they're busted open for a while. There is a response from a man or a woman or the world, or from the world of work or something to what they do. So it gathers a momentum. And then if people retreat or relationships go bad, the energies of it will go back into depression, back into fear, back into negative transference, back into attacking you. The ambivalence restores itself. You bust it open again. If something happens, in other words, it's a series of closings and openings and changings, partly in relation to what happens to that person. And they're banging at you at the whole time saying, I'm lonely. Why be open if it just makes my loneliness worse, my hurt worse, my whatever it is worse? And there isn't anything to say to that. Except, again, to point out what it costs them if they're not. And that perhaps the openness will lead to something, and maybe it won't. That's their choice. So that one is not dealing, this is the point that I'm trying to make in this, one is not dealing just with a psychodynamic problem that changes based on the openness of the person, their intent, and how smart a cookie you are about them. It ain't just that, as it is, again, in more natural therapies and relationships. It does depend on what happens to a person like that. I think that that is part of what's behind the wisdom of a study that I've mentioned a number of times. It was made, an extensive study made of cure in psychoanalysis some years ago, I think by Menninger Clinic, which found that in exploring what really produced change in psychotherapy, the conclusion they came to after studying a lot of analytic experiences is that it was 50% the therapy and 50% changes in circumstance. Namely, it's not just what you know and how good your relationships are and how good your doctor is. It also makes a difference if you get a job. May make a difference if you move one place to another. It may make a difference if you don't have a friend and then you meet somebody. It may make a difference if you thought you had cancer and you don't. Whatever it is. Now, you can say that part of why those things changed people is that they were ready to be affected by them by the understanding that they'd been doing. And there's probably a lot of truth in that. And yet, even after you make your case for the value of understanding in therapy, there's still no question that people are affected by what happens to them. There are probably a few exceptions to that. The exceptions are probably people whose values and creative fantasies are relatively unresponsive to experience. Namely, some creative people could get out of this, even if things don't get better in their lives, if they are people who have been raised on total commitments to truth, fantasies about the lonely hero or heroine. In other words, people who turn on to loneliness could probably get out of these jams without things improving in their lives. But with those exceptions, most people would really need for life to be helpful in that way. The importance of this idea gains an additional relevance to the introductory lectures to this series. Namely, we live in a time where not many good things happen to people, and where the public experience is shabby, non-creative, hysterical, superficial, and where if you come out creatively, there ain't any market for you. So that the nature of the times make an additional stress on the resolution of this problem. It is not a time historically where a blocked person has an opportune, it is not an opportune season for that kind of person to work out the problem of casting pearls. No matter how good a therapy or how good a love they have. It will be affected by the times. And again, that's a very capricious thing. It used to be in the 60s that therapists working with people like this drew support from protest movements, creative movements that stood as evidence to people and provided community for people that were beginning to challenge their negativity. Now, when the patient leaves the office, or your lover or your friend leaves you to go out in the world, it is almost sheer chance whether that life experience will cooperate with the alchemy of the therapy and the love to bring that additional force of pressure on the value to bring about the change. And what that comes down to is that some of these folks may not make it in the best of relationship and therapy circumstances, and some will, and there is a contingency factor in it. Now, it's the awareness of that risk that often makes a person who is blocked sense that in advance and not really present himself or herself for change in therapy. Namely, I somehow know at a time like this that even if I come out, things may be no different, even if I'm open. So why the hell try? Even if I know somebody I can try with, and I want to. And so many persons blocked at a time like this historically will intuitively, even if they don't go through the logic of it, lose heart before they begin. That serves as an inspiration to characters like me and to a few creative artists and persons that I know to turn us on at a time when reality is so sparse, so that hopefully again in some years, if we keep fighting for value and expression and beauty, there will again be some momentum or thread of value in the collective culture that is substantial enough that when those lost persons approach the question of whether they will start the voyage back through their darkness to the light, they will be more tempted to take the risk because there is more of a possibility of the echo of their thrust at value being met again. Okay, we'll take a break and then talk. Tonight, which I think is important. I touched on it before, but I'd like to say a little bit more about it. People who are open and not opposed to expression are a natural turn-on when you're involved with them. Namely, you get, if you are working with them in relationship or therapy, you get an energy from the relationship, from the interaction, from the conflict, that becomes the source of tomorrow's passion for it. It refuels itself, as it were. And when you relate to people like we're talking about in this course, you don't get an inspiration from them. They are depressed persons, blocked persons. They're fighting you, and there's no energy afoot. And yet, as I've tried to indicate, they cannot be affected by persons who come to them gently or without much poop or that don't know much. They tend to be affected by people who really hit them with an axe. And yet you don't get the impulse for that. You don't get a passionate inspiration from them. That's the dilemma. So what the way it comes out in the wash is that the kinds of people who are good therapists and friends to this kind of person that would turn them on to it are people who have very strong, autonomous, energy caring things that come from them, that may be occasioned by other persons, but that's a thing that they feel. And there are all kinds of sources of that. People that are working out Oedipal dramas in creative ways. People who are by nature energetic persons. People that are turned on to truth and helping as a value, regardless of who the person is. People who are lovers, who are just natural lovers, who are gifted that way, who have those instincts, who have that aesthetic, so that love pleases them, in addition to whoever the person is that they're loving. People who have aggressions that they turn toward creative or healing, to healing or whatnot, advantage, aggressive energy that's transformed into an aggressive dealing with other persons in a loving way. That and many other ways are sources of energy that are coming from the person. Now, so you got to be one of those kind of folks to help somebody who's dead, and to keep being on to blasting them and dealing with their counterattacks and being involved in this crazy, tremendously emotional process that I was describing to you tonight. You got to really have that and have it consistently, because again, you're not going to get it from the other person, which is all fine except when it comes to these fits of doubt that blocked people have in these kinds of relationships. That quality of your responding to them with something that you're not exclusively getting from them becomes a very incisive way to question you. And it's something that you really have to think through if you're trying to help somebody who's blocked. Do you really feel them? And are you really responding to a valuable openness in them? Or are you indiscriminately trying to turn everyone on whether they want to be turned on or not? Because you're turned on and you got enough energy to do it for a number of other people. Is your involvement with the person a real thing, or is it an assault on their dignity and character that may affect them, but the person they would become is not the person they are? It's something you imposed on them by your power. Because you got to be a powerful person to help blocked creative people. And to me, the answer is that you can't help them by definition unless you have resources outside the relationship. But you better be sure that in addition to those resources, your response to that person is a personal response. And if it's both, That, to me, is the optimal situation. So that when they say, are you in love with love? Are you in love with beauty? And you're going to deal me into that even if I'm not and I've been brutalized by it. So you're just going to set me up to walk down a path to get murdered again that you can't see because you don't see the murders. And even though you're being murdered, you're in love with beauty. And I'm not a lover of beauty like you are. When you hear that, you better know the part of it that's true, but you better also know that in addition to that, it's true that you are relating to their search for beauty and openness. And if you're not, you are a dangerous person who really can potentially hurt other people by your indiscriminate advocacy of an openness that is blind. And yet, if you don't have a passion for beauty or truth or whatever, there's no way you can be of help. And that's a very delicate balance. For example, there is in the community of psychoanalysis, for example, a real incisive questioning of charismatic helpers. That charisma is power, in that it is from other places than just a natural or normal response is suspect. And while it's true that many charismatic characters in the community are destructive, charisma or power is essential to the kind of healing that we're talking about tonight. You could say the same thing about a course like this, taught by a person like me, who has an overriding energy for teaching. You could say, is it real? Is it Faber imposing his philosophy and his energy and his belief in it on people indiscriminately, could really lead people off on a bad path or encourage down whatever way it was. And yet, if you analyze out my passion, if you could edit it out of a lecture, I mean, if you could take out the energy and the feeling and the part that's distinctively me, there are many persons who would not be touched by it, by just the words or the objective knowledge. So, and the same thing with people who love. I mean, it's even more true that way, that the great lovers are powerful lovers who bring a wisdom about love and a feeling for love to a relationship before they know the person. They are lovers before they're lovers. I mean, they're not just lovers in response to a person. If they don't understand that their love is personally occasioned or aroused by a given person, and they love indiscriminately, they get into all kinds of trouble, and they get other people terribly confused. because they bring amazing experiences to people who don't want them, who aren't ready for it, who have no place to put it, and sometimes who are really hurt by it because it's overly intimate or whatever. It opens up things in that person doesn't want to deal with. And yet, there are conflicts in love, dramas in love, hurts in people that we love that often can't be reached by a response that's aroused in the relationship. It can only be reached by, sometimes, people who have an amazing ability to love and can reach to that place helped by some resource or passion or kink or whatever the fuck it is in them, can reach that place. And somehow the trick, if you are that kind of person, is not to spoil your love or understanding or ability to heal by understanding it away through understanding the roots of it. I'd like to make a comment for those of you that were not here in the discussion last week. Can you hear back there? About the, to tell you a little bit, if you weren't here, about what was said, and also to add a little something to it. Sometimes after the hot experience of relation in psychotherapy or love with a person like we've been describing, there comes a time when the war quiets down and the bruised, formerly creative block person comes to feel, after all that labor and work together with the dilemma, that she or he chooses to be safe and protected. The values that this person brought to therapy or relationship as a problem and invited another person to go to war with them, that sometimes in the end those values prevail, and after it's all over the person still chooses that, and that there really isn't anything to say about that, as well as and anything to do about that, as well as saying and affirming that that is a person's right to choose to die, not be open, not express oneself, to go on in a numbed, frustrated, as an alternative to hurt and openness and vulnerability. And that there isn't anything intrinsically sad about that as an outcome, if that's what a person chooses. And there isn't anything that love or psychotherapy in its most heroic proportions can do about that. It stands as a fact. Therapy can only go on so long, and except for the most remarkable of loves, there is a limit in most love relationships to how long a war can be staged against a person's closeness, and there comes a time when you lose your goodwill or your intent or the hotness of the fight. And if the transformation has not taken place, that's what there is. And there's no way often to know that in advance. When you try to love or help a person, like we've been describing, to know whether in the end truth and openness and the former values and intent of that person will prevail, or whether what they have come to believe and value in their closeness will win. There's no way to know that. And so that what it is then is an experience that you join them in, a battle to the death, as we talked about last week, but where the outcome is very uncertain. And where after all the dramatics of the relationship are over, and those relationships are very dramatic, where a person like that tries to change a closeness, there is no way of knowing whether at the end of that relationship there will be a quiet, objective talk where the person simply says, after all this is done, I don't want to be open. I don't want to try for the job. I don't want to get it. I don't want to write music anymore. I don't want to try. And that's what it is. One thing I wanted to add to that before I go on with what I wanted to talk about tonight is that sometimes people who enter relationships in love or therapy with the intent to change their closeness are really doing so out of a grand spasm of death that's taking place in their psychology that may have enough life to it that it really looks like an intent to change. And all it is a spasm of desperation that may have a long life to it. So that one may mistakenly enter a process of change with that person, only to find at some place down the road that the momentum is really carried by the person that's trying to help or love, and that when that is faced, what the truth of the relationship is that the person, when the spasm quiets down, really feels, I don't have the energy to change myself. Often the way they'll put it is, I'm tired. I've tried 2 or 3 times in my life to get my life together, to be open. I don't have it in me anymore. I'm too old. I'm 50. Whatever it is, whatever hook they hang on it, but in truth, the flame is low, and they don't have the energy to sustain their openness independent of someone who makes it worthwhile for them to do it, namely somebody else's enthusiasm or vitality in living, and they're being honest about that. And again, there is nothing to say to that. That's a truth about many persons who are sensitive, in quotes, or were once very vulnerable, passionate persons, creative persons. is that if the flame gets beaten down much in those persons, it flickers. There is no way for that person to sustain when one reopens oneself to a hostile, uncaring world. There's no way for them to sustain a relation with a flickering spirit. And you often don't know that, whether that intent to change is really the real thing and a momentum and a fire in a person, or whether it's a death spasm. And again, when that comes, that's the truth of it. And it doesn't take being 50 to be too tired. Some people who are in their 20s already feel themselves to be used up in terms of having the energy to sustain a life of hurt, no matter how much they protest that they want it different. They really don't have it in them to make it different. And sometimes that's an untruth. It's a fantasy about themselves, and the truth is really different. The spirit is in hiding, and sometimes it is the truth. And to batter that kind of person and demand that they change and reopen themselves again is cruel. One of the things that happens in the process of being beaten into oneself, like we have described over these weeks, where people are inside their frustrations, dealing with them 2 or 3 steps divorced, totally isolated, living a mythology of hurt, is that experience tends to become very concrete. Devoid of attitude, devoid of meaning, devoid of any sense outside of what obviously happens with other people. So that if I have been long enough at being in the corner or the closet or locked up in my hurt, experience becomes a vague, non-differentiated mood of being hurt. I don't see the differences between the people who hurt me, the differences in their taste, the differences in their relation to me. I'm dumb and dull in that sense. And all I know is that everyone has hurt me, that if I give them a chance to again, they will hurt me. And even in my not showing them myself, in their indifference to me, which is a natural response because you're not relating to them, they are being neglecting and uncaring of me. So all I know is that I'm hurt all the time. And when I'm hurt, each specific time, all that hurt is that hurt. And I make no sense of it beyond the accumulation of more and more day by day. Now, one of the things that happens in a good relationship or a good therapy is that as our blocked creative person begins to come out of that place in the turmoil that we talked about last week, there is an establishment gradually and a remembering of the value of self. And that goes a long way towards breaking down this hurting experience into a differentiated one. Namely, I begin because I am being reminded of my value by my therapist, my lover, my friend, and of my relative value. I begin to see the differences between persons. I begin to learn that there are only certain persons who can know the value of my creativity and expression, that it is not relevant and doesn't connect to many persons or most, so I don't look for them to have a shot at me, to judge me or reject what I do. I don't expect them to feel it. So that much of the vague mood of hurt I felt before coming from everybody, I no longer feel anymore. So there are only specific places where I can be hurt by people that have some possibility of relating to what I do. I also learn and remind myself that in addition to that vast group of people who, if they can't relate to what I do, can't possibly feel it, hence I can't look to their reaction to mean anything. In addition to that, there are other persons who are blocked or competitive with me or hate their own lives or are envious persons, jealous persons, that by definition would hate anything I would do if it is valuable or beautiful or loving. So I can't look to their response to me to mean anything because they're going to hate anything I do, whether it's beautiful or not. And as a matter of fact, the more beautiful it is and the more valuable it is, the more they'll hate me and hurt me because they can't stand my presence. I learned that, and then I learn who those persons are that I can really look to for a response to me. And it is there in vulnerability to those persons that hurt has a reality. Doesn't deny hurt. As a matter of fact, when one relates without being closed, hurt is sharper and more incisive than when one is closed. So that it is not that no one hurts me when I'm together. I can be hurt to the bottom more than when I'm closed, but only by a certain number of persons that my judgment and self-confidence tell me are relevant to my life. So that's helpful in clearing up this overwhelming feeling of hurt that I have and my overwhelming impotent rage in relation to it that I can't go anywhere with because I'm angry and hurt and resentful all the time to the hurt that goes on all the time. So the hurt situation clarifies as I learn a context, and also my rage clarifies itself. In addition to that, I would like to offer tonight two other possibilities that one cannot really seek if they're not relevant to you, but if they are relevant and you do not know them or are not aware of them, may help with the dilemma of getting your life together when you're coming out of a hurt, creative isolation and depression. And one of them is to learn or remind yourself of a personal mythology. that adds to self-confidence and placing people in relation to you, that adds to that situation, surrounding your actions with a context of meaning that is really more than the event that takes place, namely more explicit sharing or expression of yourself, your creativity, your love, and the other person's wrath, their excitement with back, their indifference to it, abuse or sadistic attack. What mythology does, put around our individual action echoes of interpretation, connections with other events in other persons' lives, connections with momentums, with groups, with forces that give feeling to that event beyond what the other person does and what you feel about it. And largely the mechanism of mythology is psychological identification. And there are all levels of it. And one cannot rationally find identifications or construct them, teach them to oneself. They have to be those unconscious threads that are already there, just waiting to be remembered or to be made conscious for an identification to have the power to really help you come out. Now, by identifications, I mean things like, for those people who can relate to groups, finding those groups of persons or traditions or institutions that are like what one is and that represent a struggle with the same creative hurt dilemma that you have and that offer a way of responding to it. And there are many persons that can find that in relation to groups and institutions, religious ones, spiritual ones, a way of feeling a part of a tradition of response to abuse or hurt. Many people cannot make group connections or identifications. It's not natural to them. And they find them in other ways, in some form of individualism. A very strong one is often an identification with sports or physically heroic figures. And I don't mean by that popular heroes whose behaviors are exciting in some kind of media or superstar sort of way. What I have in mind there are those heroes, public heroes, who have dealt with the public insensitivity, hurt, ambivalence, and rage toward people who stand out. Sports figures, entertainers, artists, and who have found some way to go on expressing and being creative in the face of that abuse and ambivalence and hatred of them. And those careers sometimes stand in novel, in sports legend, in spoken legend, as identifications that we can make connection with, that give a shape to and an echo to our dilemma, so that when we come out again and try to struggle against hurt and to bring ourselves to this thing that once cornered us, when we do something, there is an echo of warmth or a surge of power within us that comes from our remembering that that was something that someone we value to the bottom did. And there is an experience in our doing of it, regardless of what other people in actuality respond to what we do. There is an actuality of pleasure in our doing it, and a smile or a hug or a warmth or a look from our heroes who acknowledge in our identification our relation to that drama. We join them. We are side by side with Jesus or Joe DiMaggio or Billie Jean King or whoever the fuck it is, Wilma Rudolph or Jesse Owens or wherever you find that. We are with them winning that 100-yard dash in Munich or whatever it is, in our doing that thing that is so hard to do in front of those who potentially will ignore us or torture us or abuse us or dismiss us lightly. We are with them in that, and we strike a blow for whatever they were about. Mastery, doing it better, competition, the struggle against evil and ignorance, the struggle against the limitations of the body, the attempt to fly, whatever it's about. But if we can make those connections, and if they're real and not a trip, they help us come out. So that even if we are hurt, what goes with and ignored and not responded to again, along with it, we feel a pleasure, a deep response from, as Kazensaka says, those ancestors who drink our blood, those people who were like us. Sometimes these figures are literary, artistic figures, composers, musicians, where we know something about their life, their relation to criticism. A Van Gogh, a Blake, who sold less than 1,000 books in his lifetime, who knew what it was to not be responded to, who knew what it was to have a critic, and maybe to the end of their life, butcher and misunderstand their work. And yet they went on writing the music, writing their novels, writing their poetry, doing what it is that they did, and living lifestyles that reflected that. And sometimes in the ways that they found to go on and find a meaning or a beauty in life, a way of responding to pain and courage. An Anais Nin, or a figure like that, a Karen Blixen, whatever the style was in responding to ignorance and suffering, if it strikes chords in us, we may find that person joins us in fantasy and imagination and in actuality, if when we respond in ways that echo their style, there is a warmth, a feeling of belongingness to a tradition of responding, they walk with us. We are them reincarnated, responding again. And there is a meaning in that reaches again beyond the hurt of that situation and lets us go on even though the hurt is hard. Doesn't invalidate the hurt, but it is an echo of deep feeling that goes along with it. Or the identifications may be found in relationship to mythology and fairy tale. Many times, and the Jungians have articulated a lot this process, persons of fantasy and imagination find themselves in literature and in reading myth and listening to stories, in listening to musicals about them, in listening to tales, in listening to their dreams and fantasies and visions, discover that they're Don Quixote, a heroine, a shamaness, a visionary of another era, an oracle at Delphi, whatever it is, and sometimes more than one figure. And if one explores the meaning of those mythological echoes of oneself, one often finds that those heroes and heroines of myth struggled with a hurt very similar to yours, and that their style of response gives you a clue, and when, in turn, you respond that way, they say hooray somewhere in you, and it warms you and heartens you regardless of what happens. It may be a Perseus who got his life together in the face of the parental rage against his beauty and desire to destroy him, to murder him. And he found a way of responding to the murderous feelings of other people. And in turn, the murderous feelings within himself in mastering his self-hatred. Maybe the context of your life is murder, that people in your life have tried to destroy you at that level and have creatively. And if that's so, perhaps that myth would strike a chord and give you some clue as to how to respond to that, and to know that you stand with that hero when you join that labor. It may be an Orpheus that encountered a murderous jealousy in the face of his beauty and struggled in his life with fear in relation to beauty, a fear that finally cost him his lover when he had to turn back to see her there. And she eluded him, and part of his painful, lonely struggle is his relation to that fear. Maybe that's yours. Maybe it's the labors of Heracles. Maybe your creativity lines itself up as 10 or more impossible labors. But somehow, in the impossibility of struggling against things that can't be moved, against hurts that are bottomless, parents whose withdrawal is bottomless, people that have affected you in your life whose needs are bottomless, that are giant holes of needs for love or whatever it is that made them respond to you in the ways that they did, never satisfied with you. No matter how perfect you were, no matter how much you gave, you could never please them. And finally, that process, taken to the public and battering you down, drove you into yourself. Well, maybe Heracles would stand there to give you a hand and join him in a way of relating to to the impossibility of people's demands and hurt and rage, a way of re-responding to it that doesn't drive you in and gives you pleasure even if you can't change it and fill it and heal it. And it keeps responding to you in the same way. You are by Heracles' side, cleaning the shit out of the stables or whatever it is, and you are with a brother or a sister that fought the same battle against impossibility. And maybe you're a Jesus that struggles and deals with hurt and lack of meaning, with decadence, with political jealousies, with fear in very much the same way. And there is a way of becoming Jesus' brother, sister, companion in the struggle against ignorance and lack of love. Myth is a good friend if it's your friend. If it's not your friend, myth is a trip that will set you up again for a hurt that will re-crush you. And I say that because we live in a very trippy time where identifications with voguish cultural figures are encouraged, and we can fool ourselves that these people are what I'm describing. And if they're not really, when the crunch comes, the identification will not echo, and you will feel only the hurt. Namely, you'll think that you are Anais Nin or whatever your Reggie Jackson or whatever the figure is. You'll think you're that person because that is a popular figure for identifications. And if that's not you, when the crunch comes, that person will be away from you, and the identification will do you no good. And in fact, or the pseudo-identification will do you no good. And in fact, all it did was set you up for hurt. So you must be clear that these feelings are your feelings. And if they are, they help you a lot. Another way that myth helps a great deal is that myth may be the thing that allows you to come out again by its ability to bind your overwhelming hurt or your overwhelming impotent rage. When you are without myth, hurt is often an arbitrary thing, an absurd thing. It happens to you. It makes no sense to you. And persons without mythology often feel like, how can I come out again? Because the same thing is going to happen to me again. The same people will hurt my beauty, and I don't understand it. I can't anticipate it. I don't know where it's going to come from. And when it comes, I don't know what to do because I don't know what it is. What mythology can do is to give a concept to that hurt. It may make it ignorance with a capital I, or sin, or evil. It may make it unconsciousness. It may make it hysteria. But if you can meaningfully, and again, you can't talk yourself into this, but if you can meaningfully relate your hysteria, your hurt to a mythology, it creates the possibility of relating to it. There's something that you can do in relation to it. And that allows one to come out, because the coming out is not going to add to the already overwhelming hurt, more hurt that will overwhelm you. It's not overwhelming anymore because I know what it is, and I know that I can do something in relation to it. And that may be all I need to tip the balance to make it possible for me to come out, because I can deal with it when it happens. So that it may not be what on Tuesday an editor says about your manuscript, but it may be that allows you to come out. It may be that what allows you to come out is your ability to place that in a context that you can labor against, rage against, create against, and in that have a feeling of power, of self-development, of expression that is beyond the indifference of that person. That being the 10,000th indifference in your life. 10,000 blows that make no sense to me. I'm not just a bewildered, hurt, battered child. I'm a hero or heroine struggling against ignorance and its expressions. And that's a different situation. And the same thing is true in relation to the incredible rage that people who have been isolated with their hurt feel when they reopen themselves. The rage is so great, as I talked about last week, that they often are murderous, homicidal, suicidal persons. The rage is so great they can't handle it. When you move from a vague, numbed rage and resentment and suddenly focus all that feeling, it is more than the ego can control. And that's why it's dangerous, as I talked about last week. And those persons are people who could climb on top of towers with rifles. Now, if you have no context within which to put that impotent rage, a rifle looks attractive, or murdering people looks attractive, and yet you know that there's no pleasure in that. I mean, how many times I've heard the feeling, the only thing that would satisfy me would be to murder my mother, or my ex-husband, or my ex-wife, but I know that even to get my hands around their throat and choke the life out of them wouldn't do it for me. They hurt me too many times, and the murder is over quickly. Maybe if I just torture them for life, that would do it for me, but they don't mean enough to me for even that to touch me. That won't do it. I have more rage than I can satisfy by directly taking it out in some concrete form on those people who provoke me. They're not worth all of my response. Well, if you weave around those people a mythology of evil, ignorance, political exploitation, something that you can believe in, people who are out to destroy beauty in the world, if you can make those persons relate them to a context of ugliness, the neglect of artistic treasures, whatever it is, then your rage can be bound in creative actions that may draw their well springs from your desire to murder your ex-wife, ex-husband, ex-lover, ex-friend's mother, father, but you don't have to carry out the murder in an unfulfilled way. You can use that hatred if you make a conscious choice. You can focus that impotent rage, shove it up the chakras of the Kundalini spinal cord you have, and it comes out as love, as creative action, as tasks creatively and skills that require years to fulfill or develop. It can turn itself into motivations that make for enormous expressions of selfhood, creativity, energy, love, development, and defense of beauty that may strike blows against the original herders that are fulfilling because of the mythological context you weave around it. And that makes an incredible person out of you. Sometimes in psychotherapy and love, when you come as a hurt, impotently rageful, blocked person, you come to a lover who has the capabilities of hanging in with you in your abuse, in your rage, in the depth of your despair, because they feel the same fucking thing you do, but they found a way to give it context, concept, direct it, sublimate it into something that is an equal to you in love, creativity, and beauty. Some of the most powerful, charismatic healers and lovers feel the depths of hurt and the depth of rage that they are able to transform by choice into a relevant, opposing force to the impossibilities of withdrawal and locked upness and death that people find themselves and choose themselves into. And they are, as a poem of mine says, the stranger's hand is mine, led another way. They are me having done something else with what I feel. The most relevant healers and lovers are the people that have dealt with the same dilemmas and found a way to deal with them. And people who haven't can't reach us, can't help us. And myth helps that. You can find, through a mythology, a way to relate to absurdity that doesn't deny it. Jungian psychology, which is a common criticism of mine, weaves so much mythology around the person that people are able, in the richness of that mythology, to often go on in their lives with relationships that are irreconcilably bad, abusive, non-nourishing, and work that is that way because the person finds so much meaning in their growing that it almost doesn't matter what happens to them in reality. That's unreal. That's a lie, an illusion. So the trick is, how does one weave a personally relevant identification and mythology that does not make you unreal, that isn't a lie, that gives your life meaning, but doesn't space you out, and doesn't dull your relation to the reality of somebody hurting you and the reality of absurd, arbitrary injury that you still deal with the factness of. And the way that that comes out in the wash is that if you've got your mythology straight, you will come to life with it. And when the hurt comes, you will feel it, have a reaction to it, but in addition to it, will give it meaning. And when you're not reacting to it anymore, you're unreal. So it's like reaction is the thing that tests the realness of one's mythology. Now I'll say a little bit about attitude. I don't have a lot of time. I have to try to say this kind of quickly. One of the things that happens to people who were once creative and open and who go inside is that they often change their attitudes toward expression, or they have no attitude at all. Again, that's a part of this trance-like mood of just feeling constantly hurt and passively, aggressively resentful of it and withholding as a way of life. I won't show you my feelings. I won't show you myself. But what goes with it is that we forget the ways that we once chose to express ourselves. Not what we expressed, but the way we did it, which is what an attitude is. An attitude gives a style to what we do when we live. So that what hurt people do is really lose their style. Sometimes they do learn another attitude. Maybe the attitude is a paranoid attitude, that I come to you before anything, suspicious, watching you, critical, fault-finding, the evil eye that we talked about. I'm watching for where you're going to hurt me. I see hurt where it isn't. I am paranoid as an attitude. Sometimes the attitude is a hurt attitude. In other words, I want in all of my expression for you to know that I'm a hurt person. And in the ways I say it, the wrinkles on my face, the intonations, the depth of my voice, my gestures, everything says hurt. And I want you to know I'm hurt. Even when I'm being beautiful, even when I'm trying to be creative, I am hurt. Or we learn fear as an attitude, or resentment as an attitude. We become gruff, crusty, irritable as a quality of how we are when we do everything. And that is our attitude. Now, attitude is part of what the alchemy of response and relation is. What we get from other persons back to what we do is more than what we do and what it incites in them. Part of what will either detract or add to the impact of what we bring is how we bring it. And that's a very simple thought, but a very powerful one that people that have been hurt lose sight of. Because when they come out again of their hurt or intend to, they often come out with an openness and a feeling or an open expression of anger or a beauty again but it's coming out without their knowing it with the old attitudes. A paranoid attitude, a wanting for people to know you're hurt, or no attitude at all. I'm just bringing this, but there's nothing around it. Or I bring it with fear, or I bring it with a kind of laid-back, cool attitude. I'm open, but my attitude is laid back. And the quality of that moderates the effect of what's brought. People will be less enthusiastic, less moved, and certainly in their choice of what they will respond with, less responsive, if the attitude does not inflame the provocation. So if the attitudes are negative or detracting, the catalyst of the situation, the catalytic nature of the situation is held down, and you get less back. And if you are in that inevitably testy state of, as I described last week, that I'm partly going to come out based on what people do when I come out again, if what I see is a lukewarm response to something that I know is exciting or beautiful or loving, I may say, fuck it. And judge that it's not worth it. Or the response back is not fair in relation to what I gave. And in fact, what the response back may be is the fruit of your quelling the incitement of your beauty by an unconscious hangover of attitude or a lack of attitude. Add to this that these days we are taught explicitly attitudes that are against the incitement of response and relationship. Namely, we're taught to be selfish, narcissistic in our attitudes, to give ourselves sexually, relationship-wise, work-wise, with an attitude of, I want something back. Psychological exploitation is what's taught these days as adjustment and as health. Get yours. And if you express your beauty to another person, as beautiful and as open as that is, if you've got an attitude of, I want something from you, the heart of that person, the vulnerability of that person will shrink from you, will moderate the response, and you won't get a free, open, total response from them. You'll get a moderated one. And if you don't understand why that is, you may pull back. And it's of your making because you quelled the fire between you. The thing that starts the fire is an attitude of love. And by love, what I mean is an attitude that says, I want what I bring to mean something to you. I want it to become something more in you. I mean well towards you. I want beauty for you. I want pleasure for you. I want understanding for you. I want good things for you. It is good intent in general toward the other person, regardless of what I do. It is not Judeo-Christian guilt. I'm not talking about any notion, which incidentally, Peter Marin's discussion in his sort of criticisms of some of the new psychologies reminded me of is a kind of restatement of Judeo-Christian guilt, namely that that we're not going to get things together unless we love each other, which implies if you don't, you're a shit. I'm not talking about guilt love. I'm talking about pleasure love. An attitude of loving that means more for both persons and not as an exploitation. As a pleasure, not as a responsibility. And also not as a Pollyanna thing that says, I love you no matter who and what you are and what you do. I mean an attitude of love that brings that to expression, but that, as with mythology, if somebody is a shit and hurts you back, you're not standing there in unreal fashion with your love hanging out, but you're ready to fight in kind, eye for an eye, if that's what's called for. Namely, that you respond relevantly to experience, but you bring it, you come to it with an attitude of love. I offer that as an alternative and as an encouragement, because what love does is that, when you come with that as an attitude, is that if there is somebody there that hears you, your music, your words, your poetry, your story, yourself, your movement, your body, if there's somebody there that feels it, not only will they openly, their heart respond, yet will you see in them, will they be able to allow to feel what you touch in them, but they will be in respond to you because your intent cold, not negative, critical, not none, but you are adding to that response your of love, which is your desire to deal with what they bring respectfully, to hope it becomes more for them. And that catalyzes the situation, which makes it the most it can be, which in turn gives you heart as you come out of your isolation and hurt, because you see a full response to your full response. And love is one of the few attitudes that catalyzes full response, process, momentum between people. Now, you can't teach people an attitude of love. You can't talk yourself into it like a mythology. However, many hurt, isolated people were once lovers and have forgotten it, taught themselves something else as an attitude in their withdrawal, and because it's so, the learned attitude is so close to them, can't see that it's limiting their experience when they come out. If they are around people of a loving attitude, and if love is taught publicly, which is one of the reasons I'm doing it, as a value, it may remind them again of what they once felt. And if it is a natural thing to them, they may be able to bring it back into their experience. And love may be learned emotionally as an attitude, not by someone teaching it to you, but by, in the course of your healing, being around a person who incited you to the best in you by their loving attitude. And I would say that most of the effective therapists and lovers with persons like I've been describing in this course are loving in their attitude. They want life, growth, beauty in persons independent of what it means to them. And if you are around that enough, not by being taught it or talking yourself into it, but by it rubbing off on you, you may find yourself becoming, in some measure, loving in a way that you never were in attitude, which brings a different response from life and people than you once got before. Life is different for your having known that person. It may not be a lot, but it may be a bit different for being around them. And it may be a bit different if people can articulate again the value of love in a very loveless era. As I mentioned to you before earlier in this course, you're going to be hearing more about value, the value of certain values from me, because those values are not being taught now. And in the absence of them, people fall back onto selfish, narcissistic, exploitative ones. And again, the issue is not imposing values on people, but offering and articulating the value of values that are natural to them and pointing out what those values can give to people without looking to the dynamic of those values in guilt. That's not what I'm talking about. Now, the last thing that I want to say about mythology and identification, mythology identifications and the attitudes like the attitude of love that are very helpful in experience, is that you can't sleep with and talk to mythologies, identifications, or attitudes. They help, but they are not as meaningful in our lives as real relationships are. They may not make our lives, if we don't have a real relationship, they may not make our lives totally fulfilling and satisfying because they are, by definition, passive. Those identifications are inside us. When they give us pleasure, it's me talking to me with the face of another person. And it gives me a pleasure, but it is not the pleasure of the vital war of relationship. It is not as meaningful as the appreciation of another live body. So that mythology and a loving attitude is no guarantee against loneliness and the struggle being awfully hard, but it helps you keep going. And that's a lot. Because sometimes the choice of whether you come out creatively is really that. It's not, can I have the best of lives? But it is, can I have a life that is fulfilling enough to make it worth the hurt that comes with the vulnerability? And mythology and love as an attitude can do that for you, can make it possible for you to bear loneliness without relation and keep going. May not be happy all the time, may be bummed out at times and spacey and weird, but you can keep going as a general intent, openly and vulnerably. And that's a lot. It's not everything, as some teachers of mythology and love would lead you to believe, but it's a lot. One last comment about love. In the 60s, in a time when creativity and value and beauty have a momentum, when you do something loving or mythological, and it's safe for other persons in general to respond to it, it often arouses actions which validate the attitude and the mythology, that confirm it. Because, for example, I can remember in the 60s, if you talked consciousness like we do here, for example, I can remember in discussions when consciousness was talked about, for example, politically, because it was safe and people were doing it and there was a momentum. I remember people saying, getting up and saying things like, let's rent a bus and all go to Berkeley for the confrontation on the campus. Let's do something. And it's irrelevant whether people did it, they felt like it and they said it. There was response. People wrote poetry. People wrote stories. People ventured out creatively. Maybe it was good, maybe it was bad, but they tried. And that helps one be loving in attitude. In these days, and this has been going on now for about 4 years, there is no momentum of consciousness, beauty, or love. Almost every creative action and loving action drops. It makes ripples, but the ripples seemingly add to other ripples. Every action, part of the weariness of open person, every action requires a re-choosing to do it and a getting it. One's life is a series of independent actions because there is seemingly no echo or context for it. And that makes it seemingly hard to go on with a loving attitude. But what I want to say about love is this. Instead of actions these days, people don't say much to you when you do something towards them with love. And they may not go home and write stories and paint pictures and deal the next 3 days with their life differently for what you did and let you know about it. They may not do those things because it isn't safe to do them these days. But what it may do for them is make it a little easier to go on. Not only are most people not being creative these days who have creativity in them, they are desperate, suicidal, not feeling that life is worth it, in very bad shape. And what your loving action may do is not incite anything that you can see. But I can assure you that there is an effect. But the effect is to be found in the way they get through the night, to put it in terms of a sort of context of modern song and whatnot, that they can bear up with their days a little bit better, that they're a little less depressed, that flickering flame in them, they're aware of again, even if they can't do anything with it themselves, let alone show you. But they feel the flame again. They know they're not dead. So in the silence that surrounds love now, one should not be deceived that nothing comes of it. A great deal does. One simply will not see it until there is again a momentum when people can risk coming out and expressing again, so that one can see love aroused, love excited, love responded to in some public, explicit way. This is a time, as Fahrenheit 451 says, when we're memorizing the books, because the books are being burned. And it doesn't mean that that value and beauty is not afoot. It's simply out there somewhere in the silence. I'll try to sing to you a little bit. La la, la 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 la, la la la, la 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 la, la la la, la 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 la, la 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 la. La la, la la la, la la la, la 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 la, la la la, la 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 la, la la la, la 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 la, la la la, la la la. Okay, we'll take about 10 minutes and we'll talk some. And kind of, how do you know whether this is really an end of the intent that didn't bring the healing to fruition, or whether it's a block? The particular situation that was being described is where in a relationship at a certain place in the working out of this, one person wanted a commitment, and the other person, for reasons of personal hurt and history, couldn't give that commitment. And that issue threatens to stop the healing, or to interrupt that. So without commenting on that relationship specifically, I'd like to try to speak to that as a general problem. It's really hard to know in that specific situation what it is. All I can say is that the voice of fear can be very strong. And the fear related to this prolonged experience of being hurt and isolated with it. And it becomes, as I said last week, almost like an organism. It can become demonic in proportions, capable of fabricating questions, testing, and criticisms that are extremely powerful. And I have seen that fear in psychotherapy mobilize tremendous testings that threaten to end the relationship, or seemingly signal the end of it, and were in reality just a deeper level of the struggle of working something out. One counterpart I would see in it is people opening up to a place and then running the therapist through some kind of a number of will you be my friend when the therapy is over? Or will you meet me on the outside of here? Or a testing about money. What if I don't pay you? Will you still, or if I pay you less, will you keep responding in the way that you are, and I'm going to find out by not paying you? And those testings, which may really be hard to deal with, I mean really hard, don't mean the end. They just mean a tremendous test and a rage and perhaps a time of withdrawal before the work starts again. And a resting place, really, that relates to what I tried to explain to you last week, that these relationships are so volatile and explosive that at times when the person simply can't handle how open they are, they must go to sometimes outrageous hurting lengths to stop the openness for a while until they can catch up to it and go on. So I hope that's helpful in some kind of way. Yeah. Thing about is what about the idea of setting people up to prove that they love you? I mean, I think that was an implicit one of the. I may not have talked about it too much, but it was certainly implied in when I talked about the locked up time. That one of the things that people do is run that trip on the world. You know, if you find me in my hurt, which just translates into, if you prove yourself to me, maybe I'll love you. Maybe I'll come out. And that becomes a very game that draws many people in romantically and otherwise to these locked up hurt characters, because they are echoes of fathers and mothers that pose the same love problem to their kids. So it's a very effective and common romantic kind of relationship, that the hurt person standing back and watching somebody try to crawl towards them, you know, and giving them a hassle the whole time, you know. That it's a common thing, and it fits the logic of the hurt. I mean, the hurt artist feels the right to do that. They feel the right to be tyrannical of other people. It's the tyranny of hurt feelings. If I've been abused enough, I have a right to expect you to be perfect to merit a less than fair response from me. Not that you're making up for what the world did, which is often how we interpret it, but simply that I've been so hurt, I'm not responsible to be fair anymore. And some very smart, hurt people I know, loving people basically, will say that just right out, you know. I don't understand why nothing is happening to me and why no one is attracted to me, but it's not my responsibility to be loving toward anybody. And if I'm a shit, they're lucky. But I can't understand why my life is the way it is, you know? I mean, it's that kind of craziness. Yeah, you had a question there. I guess I don't relate to the notion of success. I mean, I guess that's how I'd answer that. I mean, I would see it as you do, as a contradiction in terms. And I think that if you want to get in and successfully compete in a world that doesn't care, that you've got to probably be tough as as a way to deal with it. I mean, you're going to be put in an impossible crunch that's going to make it very difficult for you to be loving and open at the same time that you're competitive and that. I think it's just a tough one. I think what I probably wind up speaking to as an alternative, as a teacher and personally, is some notion of relating to truth or doing what is right for you to do with some kind of creative or loving attitude, and accepting the lack of public success that will probably come from that. And that if it comes, it will come for bad reasons and probably not stay very long. In other words, if what you happen to do that pleases you and that fulfills you becomes what the public marketplace wants and values, you'll get a hit of success, but as an afterthought, and it will be as fickle as the public is. Namely, it probably won't stay long. And in most of the privately creative people that I know, success passes in and out of their lives very capriciously. And that's a different way of life, I think, than what you're talking about, which is like going for it. And I think if you go for it, to keep love alive is really hard. Yeah?
Well, it seems that if you...
I was trying to say, though, is that a mythological identification, by definition, can't be different than you. In other words, it's just another person doing you, maybe with a little different style or a little different way, but it's not a change of you. It's an addition to you, or another way of articulating it, or another way to say it. But for you to feel it, it's got to be you. The feeling relation you have to that character when you read the book or see the movie or whatever it is you recognizing some of you in that. And that's not a changing of pride. It's an addition to it, not a change of the essence of it. Did you want to speak your piece? Yeah. Saying is this, that we make these connections all the time. I mean, we have favorite authors, favorite persons, people that make us cry, people that we can't stand seeing because it makes us so painfully aware of something. I mean, we have those things. All I'm doing is suggesting the value of making that emotional feeling conscious, finding out about it. What is it in those stories and people? What about their lives? And sometimes in that exploration of those feelings, you can't go look for the feeling. The feeling has to come to you naturally. You can't seek it. It has to be there. But you can search out the dimensions of it, and sometimes in doing that, you inform the feeling. You find out why the feeling is so valuable, and not only that, you can sometimes find in those mythological connections suggestions for the solution of dilemmas that you haven't found for yourself. And that way they're direct aids in living. So all I'm really talking about is making conscious something that you feel. I think that our personal philosophies are simply direct expressions of our personal mythologies. I mean, I think that mostly, unless we've really had heavy religious guilt-based mythologies imposed on us, when we really freely philosophize, we wind up with an intellectual, spiritual trip that fits our personal psychology. I mean, it speaks to our values, what touches us, what's important to us, what our ethics are, where our priorities are, or what we feel. So, I mean, I think that personal mythology is a philosophy. I mean, it is a philosophy in that sense. Yes? It's a good question. She's saying, like, what happens when these heavy tests come down with the kinds of people we've been talking about? Sadistic tests, genuine threats to the end of the relationship, sincere instability. I think that the one factor that's operating in it that is the healing thing is your intent toward that person. And that intent is what really works on them or keeps after them or keeps it there. I think what you have to recognize is that in terms of your actions, you may hit the limit of what you can do. The best therapists can get hit, and the most experienced and powerful can be hit with things that they personalize, they get hurt by, they can't handle. And certainly that would be true of the deepest of lovers. I mean, that there are certain things that could happen that stop you for a while. And I think the issue is, does it really, really stop you? Or are you just so bruised at the moment that you can't go on with the war? But the person knows that the war will start again when you get a breath of air. And I think that's what works on them. Not the fact that you might be stopped, a blind spot might, a withdrawal might be forced, there might be a temporary plateau or seeming interruption. But the issue is whether they know underneath all that, are you still there? And will you be back again when you can? I mean, I don't think that what's required is that you have to be able to do it all the time. One thing that I've expressed in other courses is that I had a dream some years ago about that I understand as my powers as a shaman, which is how I see myself. And in this dream, to make it very short, I go into the land of the dead, and it's like a church, and there are several rows. And I go into the land of the dead, 3 rows towards an altar. And when I hit about 3 rows, between the 3rd and the 4th row, all the dead that are in those rows start closing in behind me. And I try to get out, and they're all pulling at me with these moans, like, oh, this pulling, that pulling down into the grave type feeling. And I barely got out. And what that tells me is that's about how far in I can go with people. There are certain psychotic persons I've been with where I have to stop sessions early. I mean, I just can't do any more, and tell them that. If I did any more, I would have a breakdown. And that does